It's Wednesday, the 30th of November. This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Theresa Villiers, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle, The Sun's political correspondent Natasha Clark, and we'll be joined by the executive editor of The Economist, Anne McElvoy. Today, as more strikes loom this winter, the government says we can't afford big pay rises. Do workers need to accept below inflation increases?
Thank you for your support. Slava Ukraini.
Ukraine's First Lady addresses Parliament. Are we in danger of forgetting about the war? For the first time, less than half of the population now identify as Christian.
We have hope in God, and if God wants us here, then we'll continue.
Theresa Villiers wants to get rid of housing targets. Are Conservatives like her turning their backs on younger voters? And we'll be live in the Commons at midday for Prime Minister's Questions. Let's start with strikes, because ambulance staff in England have voted for strike action, and nurses, for the very first time across the UK, are to strike on 2 dates in December. This is the response from Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, who has said that industrial action is in nobody's best interests and that NHS pay demands are not affordable. He says the pay demand from nurses is a 19% pay rise. Inflation is running at just over 11%, but nurses want 5% above the retail price index, a different measure of inflation, calculating the cost of living, which is actually at 14%. So should public sector workers accept below inflation pay increases? Theresa?
I think what is being asked for just isn't affordable. Of course I want public sector workers to be paid more, but in these extremely difficult times caused in great part by global economic pressures and turmoil, these kind of numbers just aren't affordable, and therefore I would appeal for these strikes not to go ahead.
Would you appeal to Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, to sit down with the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing, and discuss what might be agreed, might be acceptable to both sides?
Well, there is a very detailed process of pay review, and I know
and the government has to recommend and submit what they think an affordable and reasonable pay rise would be. So should Steve Barclay get involved?
Well, I know that he will be wanting to do everything he can to raise wages in the NHS, but he is constrained by budgets, and of course, the NHS is under great pressure in order to clear that backlog, and strikes would have a damaging impact on that, a damaging impact on patients, so they really shouldn't go ahead.
So they should be below inflation pay rises?
Look, of course I would want to see inflation pay rises, but it just, in these instances, doesn't look to me as if it's going to be affordable.
What about your view, Lloyd? Should public sector workers accept below inflation rises, below 11.5%?
No, I think that people should expect their wages to continue their living standards as they are, or to improve their living standards. Now, there are a number of levers the government can pull to make that happen. One of the levers the government could pull is to be more astute on reducing inflation, reducing the cost of living. Now, those are levers that then affect and advantage everyone. So you could do more on some of the energy stuff, decoupling, be quicker in decoupling the electricity prices from gas prices. That's not still yet decoupled, and that would have an inflationary effect. You could do more on, for example, looking at the cost of living in terms of prices for transport. And you see in Germany where they have limited and reduced the costs of rail and bus transport, which these have deflationary impacts, and that means then, when quite rightly nurses and doctors come and say we want our living standard to maintain the same, they're not even asking, in some cases, for it to go above that. Although the nurses are saying that they need to be recognised for their sacrifice over COVID.
And do you agree with them? I mean, when you say it should be at inflation, let's take the general measure of inflation at 11.5%,
which doesn't include housing. So that's why some people do go for RPI, because that includes housing, and one of the big costs is these mortgage costs.
So are you saying 11.5% or are you saying higher?
Well, I'm not putting a figure on it. It's the unions to come forward, and then it's for the government and the employers to negotiate.
But you are saying at inflation or above?
But I think inflation is a decent asking point to start with, to say we want to stand still, and then you negotiate from there. In most other European countries, I was in Norway a few weeks ago, what happens is the unions and the employers sit down together. They have an arbitration process which is binding on both, and so the unions can't go on strike, but the employers have to pay the level that is agreed at. Now, that's the kind of pact that Labour is talking about, getting employers and businesses to work together for the betterment of this country. I'm afraid the Conservatives have totally left the court, and they just push all these things further down the line.
Well, before I come to you, Natasha, Teresa, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, that's what Lloyd is saying is not true at all. I mean, the government is doing a huge amount to help people with the cost of living, including the energy price guarantee, which is saving the average household around £1,000. It's also supporting businesses as well, without which they would have to increase their prices. And the autumn statement is also a measure which is designed to keep mortgage rates and inflation under control as much as possible.
Natasha.
Not working.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because the government obviously between a rock and a hard place. And let's not forget, when we look back to the autumn statement, which was just a couple of weeks ago, the government agreed to uplift not just pensions but benefits in line with inflation. So it's a really tricky argument to make for the government to then turn around and say, actually, these people, do not deserve a pay rise in line with inflation, but pensioners and people on benefits do. That's a very tricky argument, a very hard line to have to go down. But equally, when we look at what's happening in the private sector, not everybody is getting that inflationary pay rise in the private sector either. So there will be many workers up and down the country going, I'm not getting an inflationary pay rise, so why should someone else?
Anne, you've just joined us, so let me just reprise a little bit. We're talking about the strike action. Ambulance workers have voted for strike action. You'll know, obviously, nurses are taking these 2 days of strike action in December, which is historic. And Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, has said we can't afford above inflation pay rises. Should public sector workers accept, then, below inflation pay rises or not?
I think they can aim for slightly above inflation pay rises, but they have to be quite careful about the envelope in which they demand that. And I think one of the issues that is there at the moment is Steve Barclay's clearly this is a negotiation. I mean, it may be a negotiation that strikes are the equivalent of a negotiation at gunpoint in peacetime. But you have to have a sort of realistic view of the public finances. I think what will happen is probably something that is a minor rise. It won't keep all the unions happy by any means, but it's important for both sides to get into that territory as soon as possible to avoid the disruption that would follow if these strikes go ahead at scale.
Well, in Scotland, they've suggested 8% for newly qualified nurses, and that has started some negotiations and talks with the RCN. Let's move on. Let me show you this headline in the Daily Express. Less than half of population is Christian. The result of the 2021 census shows that fewer people than ever identify themselves Christian in England and Wales. What's your response, Teresa?
Well, it shows we're a more culturally diverse country than ever before. I think, faith and religion is in very good heart in this country. There is a huge uptake across multiple different faiths. So I think we'll all need to reflect on these census figures just in terms of what it tells us about the successful, culturally and ethnically diverse country that we are.
Well, that is absolutely true, although the number of those who said they had no religion increased to 37.2%, so 22 million as having no religion at all. So actually more of us becoming secular, broadly speaking. What was your response, certainly to the headline and obviously the detail behind it?
It's not a surprise at all. I think one thing is clear, is it's not that it's a huge growth in other religions in this country. It's not that suddenly there's huge numbers of Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims beyond what we already thought. From a relatively minor group. The vast majority of increases here is non-religion. I suspect if they'd asked the question slightly differently, are you a practising Christian, which is not what they asked, because lots of people are culturally Christian. You know, they go to church once a year, they get married in church, you know.
Yes.
I go to church for midnight mass because I like the performance and the celebration of it, you know, kind of. But I put non-religious. Lots of my other colleagues will have put Christian for the same reason. So I do think that it's probably even a bigger margin. And I think that's fine. People are entitled to find their own rate through belief and faith, and we should celebrate and support all. What I do think it says is, for example, the BBC on Thought of the Day doesn't include non-religious voices on Radio 4. It does pose questions to how we ensure that our institutions are reflecting all of those voices, including humanists. I'm a humanist, but humanism
They're just on the rest of the day, most of the time.
Well,
that is the argument here, is that religion is the space that needs a bit of protection, and even if it's around half or under half, it's still a large proportion of the population. There's not an awful lot of it on the airwaves.
Exactly. Well, I think there is quite a lot of religious and culturally based stuff on the airways, actually, and I would argue that there is not very much proactively humanist arguments on the airways. So I think we need a right balance.
All right. Well, let's talk to Sundar Katwala. We can pick up on Anne's point actually in a few minutes' time. He's the director of British Future think tank. Your response, what does this census tell us about faith and non-faith in Britain?
Well, I think it shows we're a plural society and an increasingly secular one. But, you know, I don't think it's as helpful to have a tug of war where if, you know, the Christian number is 51 or the Christian number is 46, it means we're a Christian or a secular society. Clearly, it's got more diverse over time. There are 27 million people who still have some identification with Christianity, not packing out the churches every Sunday. I'm sure 22 million people now say, I declare with no religion. That's become more normalised if you used to just say C of E. And, you know, 6 million people of other faiths, 4 million Muslims and so on. So we've got to make that work. We need the rules of the road. How do we get that right for a society of many faiths and none? How do we rub along well enough together? And
what about a little bit of context in terms of what Teresa was saying? We're more ethnically diverse, particularly in certain cities in England.
Yes, and that's a rapid change over 50, 75 years, a more gradual change perhaps over the last 10 years. I think it's really important to discuss that well. You know, if you're like me, you're mixed race, you're not in the white British group. If people are saying, you know, is London, is Birmingham and Manchester too diverse now, that's not giving an equal status, an equal voice to half of those cities. The question isn't, you know, are we going to be a diverse society or not? That was settled in the half century after the Windrush arrived. The question is, how do we make that work well? What feels fair for majorities and for minorities? The pace of change has felt quite fast, I think, for some older white British people. It's felt quite slow, I think, to younger British-born ethnic minorities who still feel there's more to do till they've got the equal opportunities that every government promises them.
Right. Well, if you can stay with us, do, Sundar. How do we make it work, do you think, since Sundar posed that question, Anne?
I think it's a great point that Sundar Katwala makes, that it feels both fast in terms of a lot of older people, and we hear it and we see those reactions in society to saying the place I live in has changed and who asked me, and that is something politicians of all parties need to take on board. But if you're a younger generation and you've been born into a multicultural society, you feel it's quite slow. And if I'm honest, I would say, you know, if someone of a sort of small L liberal disposition, I think probably not seeing that wasn't happening fast enough is something I would upbraid myself for. I think it was something that I kind of missed for a lot of years, and a lot of us are catching up with. So I think these two things are happening at once, and it's how does the politics, even when we frame religious debates, cultural debates, social debates, economic debates to an extent, how do we accommodate these two things at once? That's where I think the parties struggle with it.
Natasha?
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying, I think, Lloyd, earlier, about sort of we might not identify as Christians, but as a country, we still have, you know, it's still very much a part of society and our culture, and Christmas, Advent coming up, and, you know, it's definitely not just Christians who celebrate that. And those parts of our institutions and our culture are still there and are still a part of that life. And I think, in a way, that's actually a way which we can better integrate ourselves in society and better integrate different faiths, races, religions all together, together by coming together and celebrating in that way. And I think that's more the way to sort of bring everybody together.
And the pace of change, I mean, Lloyd, it is an interesting point, isn't it? That actually, perhaps it hasn't actually been quick enough for many young people, and young people being anything under 40, maybe.
I think that there's an interesting urban-rural divide
Yes.
here, and that's where it does start to look interestingly in terms of politics as well, because we see urban, rural or urban small town divides in a political sense, and we see them also in this census. We see also real divides between real poverty coming out in the census as well, between urban and rural as well. So these things will matter politically. What I would like to see on some of the cultural issues and some of the race issues is us not creating societies where people live in their silos of I'm a Christian or I'm white, but actually are able to celebrate and develop new cultures in a kind of, rather than treating cultures, religions, but either and races as something that should be kept apart. It's actually about how do we come together and develop new things. And I think that's what some of the race figures show in terms of interracial relationships and marriages. Actually, Britain is a country that actually wants to share and come together in many respects, and that's really quite exciting.
Teresa?
Well, I particularly agree with the last point that Lloyd made. I think, this country is a tremendous success story when it comes to huge diversity in terms of faith and culture, and still a huge amount of social cohesion and shared values. So I think we should celebrate that and celebrate the contribution that a whole range of faith communities make in our society. Whatever the numbers say, we have vibrant Christian communities and vibrant other faith communities playing their part in all sorts of aspects of our daily lives.
I mean, should we be proud of it, Sunda, in the sense that Teresa and Lloyd have set out?
I think we can take quite a lot of confidence in how we're handling this change. If we're not complacent about it, if we work harder. I mean, one of the things under the surface here of this census is ethnic diversity is going to become politically more important, not just because it's growing, but because it's spreading out as well. It's much less an inner city issue now, and much more of a suburban issue in outer London, in the home counties, across the towns and the cities. That's going to be more important in the marginal seats. So something that was, relatively marginal 20 or 30 years ago is going to be a more central feature. Everybody's got to get more confident in talking to different groups, talking to different generations, and having a conversation about demographic change that isn't just talking to the white British or just talking to the ethnic minorities, but trying to find that bridge and that contact. And we've been getting better at that, but we could work harder at it.
Can I just return to the point that was raised by Anne and Lloyd when it comes to faith? Do the changes, do the figures point to an institutional response in any way, Sunda?
I don't see people calling for the disestablishment of the Church of England, for example, because that would be an incredibly complex thing that not many people care about, and people of minority faiths kind of tend to like that status of faith. There's a big opportunity, I think, for a different institutional message in the coronation next year. You've got a Christian king, the head of the established church, wants to talk about all of the diversity. You've got a prime minister who happens to be Hindu alongside him. You've got a Muslim mayor of London. They can have a shared agenda about what it means to, respect our diversity, but work on what we've got in common. And that can cross faith lines, that can cross ethnic lines, it can cross geographic and generational lines as well, I think.
Sunda Katwala, thank you. Did you want to just...
I just wanted to say it's a shame we can't do disestablishment of the church, because then we could talk about anti-disestablishmentarianism, which, as we all know, split Parliament in the past, although it's a long time ago.
And that'll be for another day.
That's it was a little bit,
yeah. Let's have a look at this headline in The Sun. Simon Clarke, former Levelling Up Secretary under Liz Truss, has written this: scrapping housing plans would lose Tories millions of voters forever and destroy the market. Simon Clarke says the Conservative Party is at its most successful when it puts the dream of home ownership at the heart of what it offers to the electorate. Teresa, are you not standing in the way of that ambition and core part of conservatism with your amendment to scrap those mandatory housing targets?
Well, not at all. And I have a huge regard for Simon Clarke, but only 6 weeks ago he was going around saying we must get rid of these Starnlist top-down housing targets. So that slightly undermines the weight to be given to his article. We do need to build more homes, and we are building a significant number in this country, but the targets are depriving local communities of decision-making. They're also disproportionately focusing on the crowded south of England. There are better ways to deliver new homes. and to deliver them in a way which is more sustainable, which is supported by greater infrastructure, not least in our cities and towns across the Midlands and the north of England, where new homes can be a brilliant part of the regeneration project we want to come with Levelling Up.
Yeah, but do you accept that by scrapping mandatory targets, telling local authorities in areas across the country how many homes to build will lead to fewer houses being built?
I think that it may have some impact on the number of homes built, but actually, if you set a more reasonable target or you give local communities power and agency over what is built in their neighbourhood, I think they will step up. It's the problem of when housing is rammed into communities in an insensitive way, not supported by infrastructure, and in a way which damages in the environment. And future generations will not thank us for destruction of the natural environment, which comes sometimes with insensitive housing types.
I mean, is this just going to make it harder for younger people to get on the housing ladder in any shape, sense or form?
Well, it is. I think it is. And, you know, you make completely valid points about the worries that locals have with building in their own area, and it is an issue that we've talked about for many years and decades in British politics. But the idea that as a young person looking at the Conservative Party and looking at a party that is going to make house building trickier, not easier, is going to be something that will damage the Conservative Party brand. And as Simon Clarke speaks out in his article, he mentions Margaret Thatcher and the things that she did to make young people able to buy a home easier was a key part of that electoral success. And obviously it's getting harder and harder, and I think obviously locals do have legitimate concerns, and perhaps would it not be easier to sort of try and tweak that and put some sort of local protections in place rather than scrapping them all together? Is that something you might be willing to look at?
Well, I want to see these targets go, but obviously, any improvements to the current system would be welcome. But it is just the case that the targets are an insensitive way to drive home building, and as a result, local communities and their elected representatives are increasingly disempowered and are forced to accept development which is wholly out of character with the neighbourhood, which loses green fields, whereas we should have a stronger focus on derelict industrial land, other brownfield sites. We can deliver these homes, but without the destruction which is coming with these targets.
But is the Conservative Party turning its back on younger voters? I mean, Simon Clarke is saying they're going to lose millions of voters forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that's fair. And I think when you look at Sun Regis specifically, quite a lot of them are renters, actually. And I didn't know this looking at some of our sort of statistics on who reads our paper. A lot of them are renters and looking to buy. It's not all mortgage owners. And I think that is a really key part of the next election is going to be house building, definitely.
Lloyd?
I mean, we've seen house ownership plummet under this government, and probably over actually 20 years, so over other governments as well, because we've not built enough houses. We've thought that the private rented sector is a solution. It is not. No one should be in the private rented sector in the long term. They either need permanency in social and council housing or permanency in home ownership. And what we need is house building, and we need it in the green belt. We need it on green patches of land. I'm fed up with people saying, no, I want our cities to be more crowded. I want our towns to be more crowded. Please build on urban sites. No, we need to build towns and cities on green land. A tiny proportion of our land is built on in this country. If you took all the housing stock, you could fit it in the golf courses of all of our country. That is a disgrace. And actually, I think the targets should go up. But what should also happen at the same time is local authorities should be empowered to be able to make proactive stances at the beginning. Because what happens at the moment is local authorities have to wait for a developer to come along. And then Teresa's right. The developer proposes only high-end houses that are totally inappropriate for the area. If, like the house that I grew up in, the local authority built the roads, they built the school, they built the infrastructure, and they sold off the little plots for people to be able to buy. That almost doesn't happen now because local authorities have been gutted from any funds to be able to build infrastructure first.
All right.
Because what now happens is you have to have the building first and then the infrastructure levy comes, and it's too late for people to be able to start to feel that they have had an improvement in their local area. So yes, the system needs to change, but the housing targets are not the problem. The problem is the way that the system is designed and that local authorities are hands off.
Teresa, build on the green belt. Has he convinced you?
No, he hasn't. I think that would be hugely environmentally destructive, and I would strongly oppose that.
Would you build on the South Downs then?
I would build on parts of the South Downs, yes. Some of those villages could double in size quite easily.
Well, it's quite interesting hearing, first of all, Theresa very much sticking to her guns, and there's a political point about losing votes, but also, yes, build on the Greenbelt.
Yes, build on parts of the Greenbelt. The idea that the Greenbelt should all be sacrosanct, I think, is nonsense. All of the Greenbelt is not of equal value for future generations. Theresa, and houses and housing is. I thought it was a slightly bizarre thing that Lloyd just said was that no one should be in the private rented sector for all of their lives or a long time. But why not, Lloyd? If it is well regulated, it's the way most of Europe does its housing.
Germany.
And you will certainly not be able to produce enough, unless you've got a magic wand that I'm not aware of, council and social housing to fit demand. So two things need to happen is the rental sector needs to work better. It needs to be incentivised for good landlords to be able to rent long term, as ways still many of my friends who are professional people live in Germany, for one example, the Netherlands for another, and others. So I do think we're getting off track here, where we try to say at the centre, this is how you should live and build. But if you go away from the targets,
in Germany than Britain.
This is why Simon Clarke has changed his tune somewhat, is the government knows, Rishi Sunak knows, that he is on the line here, and going with this dim sum menu in which you all decide what you might like to sign up to is endangering the government's reputation on housing.
But this is the problem, actually, you've touched on it there. This is weakness of Rishi Sunak. Yes. We've seen this repeatedly. Rishi Sunak is now threatened that he's having to pull the levelling up bill because he's scared that he can't get it through. He is a Prime Minister with a majority of 60, but he's acting like he's got a majority of 2.
Lloyd, this is about parliamentary scrutiny. This is about making sure this bill works both for the environment and for home building. And I would point out, you criticise the Conservatives for, in your view, not building enough homes. We're building about 3 times as many homes as Labour did when they left.
I think I said over 20 years there have been failures. I acknowledge that
successive governments have not built enough homes, and there is the point about the private rented sector is not actually in a state to provide the sorts of homes you were not aware of.
Actually, Michael Gove has brought forward really revolutionary reforms, proposals on the private rented sector, but the government won't give it time to come forward.
But you just said you didn't want anyone in it.
No, I don't want people in it, stuck in it for the long term.
The charge, though, is that you are going to lose out politically, Theresa. Is Simon Clarke right that you are going to lose millions of young voters? You're sacrificing the young for focus and concentration on older voters.
I do not accept that. We have a strong offer for young people, and that includes building new homes. But we have to have the right homes in the right places, and we have to look to deliver them in an environmentally sustainable way, in tune with the character of the neighbourhood and the people who live there.
I also just wanted to point out, I do agree with Theresa on your land banking amendments as well. I think that's a very important point which we haven't really touched on. The fact is that there are so many houses that developers sit on that land and are not built on it. It's already approved. We've already had the argument. Argument's already been won in appropriate areas, and those houses just aren't being built quick enough.
Right. I mean, just briefly, are you supporting, or not supporting, I should say, Theresa Villiers' amendment about getting rid of targets?
Well, I'm not personally supporting it. My understanding is that the Labour Party is not supporting getting rid of targets, but I'm always willing to be corrected. I think what we do support is some of the stuff around land banking, and we put that in our last 2 manifestos, in fact, to say that we would require developers to use the land that they had land banked, and if they didn't, they would lose it.
What about the triple lock? The triple lock for pensioners, Anne. I mean, there's been a huge debate around it, but in the end, the government has come out and said it will increase pensions in line with inflation, set at that point at about 10%. Labour supports it too. Is that a contentious policy when it comes to sacrificing younger voters, paying for older voters, or not?
I don't really feel about the triple lock as badly as some people do when you look at the fact that our pensions are relatively low. And if you look at what people get back, if you had a contributory system, like a lot of continental Europe, a lot of people would be doing much better out of the pension system. More cynically, Jo, you can say, well, here is this group who are likely to continue to vote Tory, because I don't think that the Conservatives at the moment have a really good offer for younger voters, or indeed for those who are not very, very young. I'm not talking about people who are out there in the hot pants. I mean people who are really, starting 30s, families. I think this is the big problem for the Conservatives. So, in a sense, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul with the triple lock, but it's interesting, isn't it, that Labour hasn't really gone into battle on it. Why? Because I think they also know that pension vote, is an important one.
It's important that you mention housing and pensions, though, because a lot of the poor state of our private rented sector and housing is because people didn't have trust in their pensions and they invested in small time one or two houses. They're not usually very good landlords. Good landlords are usually, as you have in Europe, institutional investors. They run lots of housing. They run them as professional operations. And so what we also need to do is find a way for those one or two household landlords to get out of the market, but get a good return for that, invest their money in a different vehicle, and then repurpose those houses into to buy council housing or a different form of private rented sector that is about permanency and that is not about the current private rented sector, which is about temporariness.
Your colleague, Theresa Villiers, Sir Charles Walker, Conservative MP, says there needs to be a quid pro quo for younger generations, for looking after, as he says, the elderly. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, yes, in many ways. And our programme of support with the cost of living obviously benefits all generations. The energy price guarantee is crucial in terms of tackling household bills for young
generations to hold on to.
Well, in the autumn statement, the Chancellor allocated nearly £5 billion extra for schools and education, recognising that we have to have a balanced approach which is fair to all generations.
Yes, that's true. That childcare still not being sorted, which affects mainly younger people. If we're talking about young being under 40, I think is kind of the definition we're using at the moment. If you look at people in the private rented sector again, they weren't eligible, lots of them, for some of that financial support for household bills because they are secondary metered and they don't have a relationship with the energy company. If you look at the changes on voter ID, for example, young persons bus passes, young persons rail passes not accepted for voter ID, but old persons bus passes and rail cards from the same operator accepted for voter ID.
Yes.
There is clearly a policy in the Conservative Party to undermine young people and then to disenfranchise young people, so it doesn't matter because they won't even get a vote.
Well, that's quite a charge, Theresa.
Well, that's just nonsense.
That's what's happening.
Voter ID is about cracking down on voter fraud.
Well, then accept voter ID from the same operator. Accept voter ID from the same operator. If a railway company has given an old person and a young person voter ID, accept both for a vote, but you don't at the moment because it is discrimination.
Are they the enemies of aspiration for young people?
I think the Conservative Party's offer for young people should be stepped up completely. And yeah, I think that it's not just housing, like Lloyd mentions, it's childcare, it's the pensions offer as well. I mean, I think young people will rightly look at the policies on offer and think, what am I being offered by the Conservative Party? And that is something that Rishi Sunak is going to have to get to grips with. He's saying that his priorities in the next, sort of 6 months to a year are sort of focusing on things like tackling illegal immigration and getting the economy sorted. It's not that young people don't care about those issues. It's just they care about other issues too. They care about being able to buy a house. They care about being able to afford to start a family. They care about childcare. And that offer I just don't think is there for the Conservative Party at the moment.
But sorting out the economy is just crucial for young people's opportunities, as is the massive programme of improving skills, which is there to give young people and older people opportunities to get the high-paid work that they want. And also everything that we do in terms of getting inflation down, getting mortgage rates under control is absolutely vital for giving young people the good start in life that they deserve.
And briefly?
We don't really hear anything much decisive from the government on education, and if there's one thing I think which people can agree on, whether they're young themselves or they're starting and bringing up families, is that is decisive. It's obviously an area where we've seen a lot of shifts and changes in the system. I'm talking about education in England, obviously the differences in Scotland and Wales, but nonetheless it doesn't feel like it's central, and that perplexes me a bit about Rishi Sunak, because I think he is naturally a meritocrat. He's very driven for a lot of people to do well. He thinks that's important to a society. And yet you've got a fairly kind of lame education offer. I mean, most people honestly cannot remember what Tory education policy is right now. And I think that is another area we haven't touched on. But if to the point you were making, if you want to signal importance about what happens to the generations, well, looking like you're serious about getting a better education system that's broader, fairer and better is really the way to go.
You mentioned Rishi Sunak. Of course, we have Prime Minister's questions in just over 10 minutes' time. But first of all, listen to this. It happened in Parliament yesterday.
When the occupants are ousted from the Ukrainian land, when our people can return home, the world will be able to thank Britain for not only helping to stop evil on the battlefield, but also for helping to restore justice by condemning and punishing this evil. I believe it will happen. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Slava Ukraini.
The First Lady of Ukraine there, Elena Zelenska, I should say. You saw sitting next to her there the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. He said that her visit must shock us awake again. Do we need to be shocked awake again?
I think probably we do. It is important to remember the shocking crisis in Ukraine. And we also obviously need to focus on ensuring we continue to look after the Ukrainian refugees that we're hosting in this country.
Is Ukraine fatigue setting in amongst your constituents or not? Lindsay, sorry. Lloyd.
I'm not quite Lindsay Hoyle yet.
No, not yet.
A few more decades, I think, to get to that stage. Look,
set your ambitions.
There is always a danger in long-running conflicts that people lose focus. But the reality is that we need to be totally clear that Russia must fail and Ukraine must succeed. And it's not about Russia and Ukraine, actually. Already now we have a war burdening on the Turkish-Syrian border, where Turkey is invading up to 2 kilometres, they're proposing, into Syrian territory that they will annex. You, of course, have and Turkey's an ally. You have, of course, China and Taiwan. The danger is, if Russia is shown to succeed, that it can change international borders through force, allies and non-allies will start to get a glint in their eye, and those long-running little areas that they wanted to invade but haven't quite done, they will do so. So there is an imperative for wider world stability that we make this win. The question then is, how do you win? Because I think Russia will fight like a dog till the end, and so that means that we need to either be braced for a very long war, that we grind Russia down, the losses are so big for Russia that it's the Russian people saying we need to withdraw. That requires a long-term support, or we have to escalate it, but the dangers there, of course, are literally annihilation. So it's very difficult choices that we make, but we must be solid with Ukraine and with the armaments that they need.
Anne?
Just as a former kind of Moscow person, you know, obviously during the rise point, I agree with a large amount of what Lloyd has said. I think Ukraine has to win and be seen to win. It means I don't think we can kind of entirely pick and choose. You know, we have to be on the side of Ukraine. When you say escalation could lead to annihilation, I think that is well overcooked. I think we're well short of that as a risk. But you know, you're right to be wary about it. One thing I can sort of guarantee, and I'm not the only person who said this, you know, Vladimir Putin will go for a long war because that's how he thinks it will grind us down in a difficult winter in Europe.
Just going to interrupt briefly to welcome viewers from the BBC News Channel. We are talking about the visit of Ukraine's First Lady yesterday. Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker in the House of Commons, said in his remarks that her visit must shock us awake again. Anne, sorry, just to continue on your thoughts there, do you think we do need to be shocked awake again in terms of support?
Well, I have to say, I think if you look at the international compact, the UK is doing pretty well, actually. The political class is very solid. I've been in America, where I think there are many more schisms around the Biden administration, and a slight sense that they're getting a bit bored with it and would like, and we saw one of the generals, Mark Milley, come out and say that, or the Pentagon general. I thought that was a dangerous moment. It was closed down pretty quickly. Continentally, we know that there are fissures on how far to go to support Ukraine. So I think Britain, on this sense, I'm not, you know, for the pat-on-the-back complacency model here, but I think we're doing pretty well. What I can guarantee is we will come under more pressure. There will be a propaganda assault on Britain from the Kremlin, precisely because we're such a solid ally. So it's not so much me shocking awake, it's that bit in the marathon, you know, when you're at the 13K and you've got the other 13 ahead.
Well, thankfully,
you have to keep going.
Quite that, yeah.
I'm talking like I do.
There's a danger with too much shock therapy. Yeah. What happens is people get muted to it later on. So it does need to also be constant, not just scare stories.
Natasha, briefly.
I think we do need to remember, though, the people at home and sort of their everyday lives will not, sadly, be dominated by this war. It is not that people in Britain do not care. We know how generous they are in opening their homes to the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees that have come to this country. But people trying to put food on the table, trying to pay their mortgages, it might not be their first priority. I think what the government and, to be fair to the opposition, have done incredibly well is link those two things together. Your inflation is going up because of the cost of energy, because of the war in Ukraine. That helps keep things at the front of people's minds and makes people realise that these two things are linked and, we can tackle them together.
Let's introduce Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, as we have just over 5 minutes till Prime Minister's questions. We spoke last week, Chris, about both Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak sort of finding a groove and hitting their stride, which they seem to some extent. Now Rishi Sunak is facing rebellions on many fronts. We talked about one here with our guests when it came to housing targets. There's also onshore wind, approach to China, and so on and so forth. What is the mood, do you think, in the Conservative Party?
I think there's a chance, that the whole housing question might just feature in the next half hour. As far as mood in the Conservative Party is concerned, I think there's two things. One is a kind of relief that there's a certain sense of stability, that we're not in a conversation, the kind of perennial conversation of 2022, which was basically how long will the government last? That was the recurring question with various prime ministers, wasn't it, during the course of much of this year. That's kind of calmed down, but then the coming question is one of, can Rishi Sunak get stuff done? Yes. And there's the beginning of a thought that maybe that will prove tricky, whether it be, around questions of housing, or there's the question, as you say, around onshore wind. And then there's the coming question, if you like, as far as Labour are concerned, which is, what do they stand for as they try and present themselves as an alternative government? I wonder, for instance, if the whole question around private schools and charitable status, something that the Daily Mail's been getting excited about in the last couple of days as far as Labour's prospectus is concerned, might just feature as well.
Right. In terms of a distinct message, there has been, as you say, quite a bit of commentary about how much of a difference there is between the Conservative and Labour offer at the moment, or that people can't see it clearly enough.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of that, and I think, why is that the case? Well, I think partly it's because Rishi Sunak's trying to find his feet and work out what he might be able to get through, in other words, what his backbenchers might be able to live with. And then from Keir Starmer's perspective, I think there is a desire for him and the front bench of Labour to start doing stuff where they're not just in a kind of reactive space, responding to what the government's doing, but rather setting out their own agenda, but at the same time, not from their perspective doing too much of that when we could be still quite a way out from a general election. So I think that's why you've had, if you like, I think at PMQs last week, something of a 0-0 draw, to be honest, and that sort of sense of, it's not mid-term anymore, but equally we're not kind of in the hurtling towards an immediate general election as far as most people see it. And so you see this element of shadow boxing playing out as both try and work out the measure of each other and the measure of their own parties and the measure of where we are likely to be in the electoral cycle.
Well, to refer back to potential rebellions, former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg has told Conservative Home that rebellions are ill-advised. He was talking on Conservative Home's Mogcast out today. Let's just take a brief listen.
I think these rebellions are ill-advised. Are they out of control? You've done the studies, you've reported on the studies that rebellion has been getting bigger since the 1950s and seems to be getting further and further. It is harder to stop under current circumstances for a number of reasons, partly the mandate. The mandate is important, and the mandate was Boris's, and therefore it's hard to turn around and say, you must vote for this because it was in the manifesto, when inconvenient bits of the manifesto have been jettisoned.
Chris, I'll come back to you in a minute. But first of all, Theresa, do you think Rishi Sunak is lacking a mandate and therefore cannot push through things that he'd like to because of people like you rebelling?
He has a mandate. We got that mandate at the general election. Our parliamentary system means that we've now vested that mandate in Rishi. Turning to rebellions, it's not something that I engage in very often. I mean, for me, on the housing question, it's just so crucial for my constituency. I felt that I had to table these amendments. But I am also very much wanting to try and find some kind of negotiated solution, which means that we don't have to put the amendments to a vote.
Right.
But I also believe that MPs do need to stand up for their constituents, and sometimes that means speaking out against what the government is doing and trying to change the approach taken by the government.
I mean, that will be an argument, no doubt, Chris, put by many other Conservative MPs, because what Theresa Villiers is rebelling on was part of the manifesto, I think, in 2019.
Yeah, and this is where you get back to that whole question that Jacob Rees-Mogg was reflecting on around the question of mandate. And we saw, didn't we, Rishi Sunak trying to own that mandate in his words in Downing Street when he became Prime Minister, saying, look, it was a Conservative mandate, it wasn't a Boris Johnson mandate. You hear Mr Rees-Mogg making an argument that is a little different from that. So, yeah, you're going to see, I think, and we see it already, the reality for Downing Street that the majority, notionally, that the Conservatives have doesn't seem that big if you're sitting in Downing Street and hearing noises off, whether it be on housing targets or on energy generation or on plenty of other things. And I think as you see a general election, appear on the horizon and get closer, you'll see Conservative MPs perhaps nervous about retaining their seats, being willing to be more independent-minded in public.
Anne?
I'm just amused by the fact that everybody thinks their rebellion is the right one. Theresa never rebels except on this. Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks this is all very regrettable, but in fact was quite big on the old rebellion, wasn't he? When it came to the aftermath of 2016. So you come back to that is, can the centre hold? Can the Prime Minister somehow get a grip on this? Of course, the lack of a mandate is a problem, but that's the way politics has worked out. And I think at some point he has to face down his party and say, look, either you agree to be led by me, I can't be led by all of you. That is really, I think, the way to absolute electoral disaster for the Conservatives.
I think that is Rishi Sunak's now biggest task, is to define who he is, what he stands for and what he's going to try and get his premiership to achieve. And at the moment, we really don't know what that might look like.
I mean, we know, don't we, Sir Keir Starmer has dropped most of his leadership platform that he stood on to become leader of the Labour Party. Is that a problem?
Well, I think that a lot of the policies, once they come out from Labour, actually are generally what he pledged and what he promised. But of course, there is spin and discussion around.
Hasn't he admitted himself that he's essentially ripped up the Labour manifesto and stuff?
Well, what they said is, we've ripped up the Labour manifesto and we're going to launch a set of policies. And so far, the key policies that they've launched are all similar policies.
So we shouldn't believe a word, really, should we? That's written either in a manifesto or even on a leadership platform.
What it is so far. And I would like him to admit to more of what he promised in the leadership, like uniting the party. But what he has done so far, which I think we have done and still got more work to do, but I think what he's done so far is shown that credible leadership is positive.
We're going into PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure colleagues from around the House will want to join me in congratulating England on last night. Commending Wales for inspiring millions, and also wishing everyone a happy St Andrew's Day. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Tommy Shepherd.
In 2014, his predecessor David Cameron signed up to the Smith Commission, which promised, amongst other things, that nothing in its report would prevent Scotland becoming an independent country should the people of Scotland so choose. Can I ask the Prime Minister, does he share that view? And if he does, and in light of last week's Supreme Court judgment, will he bring forward legislation to allow that choice to be exercised?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did have that conversation not so many years ago. It was described as a once-in-a-generation referendum. But and we discussed this last week. I think what the people of Scotland want is for us to be working constructively together to focus on their priorities. That's indeed what we're doing in his own area, investing hundreds of millions of pounds in a growth deal and ensuring that with a new concert hall we can enshrine Edinburgh's reputation as a city of culture.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned from the South Pacific and I found there a deep... I've resisted the All Black jokes, Mr. Speaker, but I found there a deep concern at the expanding tentacles of communist China. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that China is more than just, as he put it, a systemic challenge, but in fact an expanding, serious geopolitical threat?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, China is indeed a country with fundamentally different values to ours and an authoritarian leadership intent on reshaping the international order, but actions speak louder than words. And that's why we passed the new National Security and Investment Act. Just recently, we used that act to block the sale of Newport Wafer Fab. And this week, with our announcement of Sizewell C, we ensured that China's state-owned Nuclear Energy Corporation will no longer be a part of the project. This government making sure that we protect our country's security.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I join the Prime Minister in saying, well done, England. And I hope we can say that next week and the week after. Commiserations to Wales, so I'm sure we'll be back in the World Cup tournament before too long. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we mark that tomorrow is World AIDS Day. Mr. Speaker, Winchester College has a rowing club, a rifle club, an extensive art collection. They charge over £45,000 a year in fees. Why did he hand them nearly £6 million of taxpayers' money this year in what his Levelling Up Secretary calls egregious state support?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased he wants to talk about schools, because we recently announced billions more funding for our schools. We're helping millions of the most disadvantaged children catch up with their lost learning. And we're driving up school standards, Mr. Speaker. But during COVID, he wanted to keep schools closed. We shouldn't be surprised, because I listen to parents and he listens to his union paymasters.
Mr. Speaker, his Levelling Up Secretary, I see him down there, who, after all, was Education Secretary for 4 years, said you could scarcely find a better way of ending burning injustices than scrapping these handouts. And here's one. He talks about driving up standards. Just down the road in Southampton, and he'll know this, 4 in every 10 pupils fail their English or Maths GCSE this year. 4 in 10. Is that £6 million of taxpayers' money better spent on rifle ranges in Winchester or driving up standards in Southampton?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about school standards. It's under a Conservative government, and thanks to the reforms of the former Education Secretary, that now almost 90% of schools are good or outstanding. That's where we came from. But Mr. Speaker, whenever he attacks me about where I went to school, he is attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people in this country. He's attacking people like my parents, Mr. Speaker. This is a country that believes in opportunity, not resentment. He doesn't understand that, and that's why he's not fit to lead.
Mr. Speaker, if he thinks the route to better education in this country is tax breaks for private schools in the hope they might hand that sum down to state school, that's laughable. Trickle-down education is nonsense. And, Mr. Speaker, it's not just the Levelling Up Secretary. His Education Minister sitting there asks, how much better would it be if Conservatives got rid of these handouts? He talks about his record. It's simple. He can carry on being pushed around by the lobbyists, giving away £1.7 billion to private schools every year, or we can put that money to good use. End the Tory scandal. He talks about his record. Hundreds of thousands of children leaving school without the qualifications that they need. I've made my choice. What's his?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're improving school standards for every pupil in this country. It's our reforms that are leading to us marching up the PISA league tables for reading, for writing, more good and outstanding schools, more investment in every single school. But he talks about choice. This is about supporting aspiration, Mr. Speaker, and that's what this government is proud to do.
Mr. Speaker, he really does need to get out more. And he talks about aspiration. Mr. Speaker, they are killing off aspiration in this country, and it's not just education. Why is the dream of home ownership far more remote now than it was when his party came into power 12 years ago?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what have we done in those 12 years? The highest number of new homes started in 15 years. Largest number of first-time buyers in 20 years. He talked about 10 years ago. What do we inherit? The lowest level of house building in a century.
Mr. Speaker, would you believe it? Mr. Speaker, the simple fact is this. Every year, the age at which people can buy their first home goes up. At this rate, under this government, a child born in the UK today wouldn't be able to buy their first home until they're 45. Now, I love my kids, but I don't want to be cooking them dinner in 30 years' time. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've heard he's having a relaunch. Apparently, it's called Operation Get Tough. So how tough is he going to get with his backbenchers who are blocking the new homes this country so badly needs?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're delivering record numbers of new homes under this government. That's what we're doing. He talks about toughness, Mr. Speaker. He's too weak to stop dozens of his own MPs joining the picket lines. So what, if he wants to support those hard-working families and show some leadership, why doesn't he confirm right now that no Labour MPs are going to join those picket lines?
Mr. Speaker, whichever way you slice it, it's always the same. Whether it's private schools, oil giants, or those who don't pay their taxes here, every week he hands out cash to those that don't need it. Every week he gets pushed around, and every week he gets weaker. But I can help him with this one. He doesn't need to do another grubby deal. If he wants to defeat that amendment from his anti-growth backbenchers on national targets for housing, Labour will lend him the votes to do so. Country before party, that's the Labour way. Why doesn't he try it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we did hear too weak to confirm no one on the picket line. But Mr. Speaker, it's the same old Labour ideas: more debt, more inflation, more strikes, and more migration. He tells his party what they want to hear. I'll take the difficult decisions for this country, and that's the choice, Mr. Speaker. It's the politics of yesterday with him, or the future of the country with me.
As hosts of this week's International PSVI conference, the UK again highlighted the need for more action to prevent sexual violence in conflict. With heart-rending accounts of women in Ukraine being brutalised in this way, and reports that a third of women in conflict zones can be victims, will the Prime Minister champion with me as his Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief the work being undertaken with young people across the world to prevent religion or belief being weaponised, which can later manifest into sexual violence in conflict?
Prime Minister.
Councillor, I'm incredibly grateful to my honourable friend for her dedicated work in this area. And she's absolutely right to highlight that this week the UK hosted the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative Conference. It was an incredible success. I pay tribute to all those involved, and as she said, we managed to reach a new political declaration in the conference where over 50 different countries have agreed to put an end to sexual violence in conflict, and she deserves praise for all her work in this area.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blandford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in sending prayers and condolences to the wife of Doddy Weir, who sadly passed away at the weekend. The absolute giant of a man, an inspirational figure in Scottish rugby, and someone who raised £8 million for M&D charities over the course of the last 6 years. Our thoughts and prayers are with Cathy, with Hamish, with Angus and with Ben. Mr. Speaker, let me wish everyone a happy St Andrew's Day. And those that know anything about St Andrew know that he's not just the patron of Scotland, he's celebrated right across Europe. That is why it is such a sad sight to watch this Prime Minister rammed through a bill that would rip up 4,000 pieces of European law, laws that protect workers' rights, food standards and environmental protections. And it's an even worse sight watching the leader of the Labour Party desperately trying to out-Brexit the Prime Minister, ruling out freedom of movement and any hope of a Swiss-style deal. Brexit is now the elephant in the room that neither the Tories or Labour are willing to confront. When will the Prime Minister finally see reality and admit that Brexit is a significant long-term cause of the UK economic crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by joining my honourable friend in offering our condolences to the family and friends of Doddy Weir, and I'd also like to pay tribute to him for his campaign to raise awareness of MND, which has made a big difference. Now, Mr. Speaker, straightforwardly, I was proud to support Brexit. It was the right thing for this country. It allows us to, first of all, get control of our borders, which is incredibly important, and reduce migration, all of which, Mr. Speaker, I noticed what he said, and I agree with him, actually, about the slight dexterity of the Leader of the Opposition on these topics of free movement. And I know he'll join me in reminding the Leader of Opposition about his previous promise to defend free movement of people, not something that we support, Mr. Speaker, but we're also seizing the economic opportunities, deregulating and signing trade deals around the world. That's how we'll drive growth and prosperity.
Ian Blackford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks on Doddy Weir, but once again what we're seeing over Brexit is better together. We're used to that in Scotland. The problem for both the Prime Minister and the Labour leader is that when it comes to Brexit, even their own voters don't agree with them. The last YouGov poll showed a record 56% now believe it was wrong to leave the European Union, and that figure is 71% in Scotland. 1 in 5 who actually voted for Brexit have now changed their minds. More and more people across these islands are wise to the fact that "Make Brexit Work" is just another stupid slogan. But Scotland can't be stuck with a new Brexit Together coalition of the Tories and Labour. So on this St Andrew's Day, can the Prime Minister finally tell people in Scotland the democratic path to escape Westminster control, to deliver independence, so we can get back to the European Union?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, he talks about democracy and votes. I think the difference between him and I is that I respect the result of referendums. He talks about this. Just remember one thing, Mr. Speaker. We had the fastest vaccine rollout in the world. We had that because of our freedoms after leaving the European Union.
Mark Palsy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, manufacturing remains a key part of the UK economy, and for the West Midlands, that means automotive. That's important in my constituency of Rugby, which includes firms in the supply chain and workers at Jaguar Land Rover. With the move to all new cars sold in the UK to become electric by 2030, means that which is critical for us to have a site for battery manufacture. Assembly is already taking place elsewhere in the world where batteries are made. So will the Prime Minister give his support to the bid for a gigafactory in Coventry?
Prime Minister.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend's efforts to progress this project. We're fully committed, Mr. Speaker, to securing investment to grow our electric vehicle supply chain. Now, although he'll know I can't comment on individual commercial negotiations, we did announce in the Net Zero Strategy £350 million of funding in the Automotive Transformation Fund to support the development of that supply chain, and I wish him every success in his bid.
Colin Eastwood.
Yesterday, BBC Northern Ireland announced cuts to programming and jobs at BBC Radio Foyle that, in my view, will leave the station totally unsustainable. The BBC Charter places an obligation on that organisation to allow audiences to fully engage on local issues. This decision, in my view, is a very clear breach of that obligation, leaving licence fee payers outside the Greater Belfast area without proper local programming. Will the Prime Minister act to defend this very important local public broadcasting service?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe very strongly in local public broadcasting, and indeed the government has taken steps to support local media. I'll be very happy to look at the specific issue he raises and bring it up with the BBC when I next see them.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Guildford tell me they want women and girls to feel safe, and I'm delighted to have had some successes in getting lights turned back on, including on York East Bridge on behalf of concerned students at the University of Surrey. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that even in difficult times we cannot take a single step back from the brilliant work this Conservative government is doing to tackle violence against women and girls?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, like my honourable friend, the government is committed to tackling violence against women and girls and making our streets safer. We've created the Safer Streets Fund, which funds additional patrols, extra lighting and more CCTV. And indeed, the Street Safe online tool allows users, including those in her constituency, to pinpoint locations where they feel unsafe so that the local police can take appropriate action. And I'll continue to support her in her efforts.
I've been up sorry.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The two boys, 16-year-old boys, Charlie Bartolo and Kiani Sianko, were tragically killed in my constituency of Erith and Thamesmead this weekend. My heart goes out to the families and friends left behind. We really need to come across the House to address and tackle serious youth violence. So can I ask the Prime Minister what he is doing to address knife crime epidemic?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question and join her in expressing my condolences to the family and friends of the two boys. I also read about it. It's an awful tragedy. She rightly asked what we are doing to make our streets safer and stamp out the scourge of night crime. We're boosting the number of police officers, as she'll know, 15,000 on our way to 20,000, and we're also giving them the powers they need to get knives off our streets, including lifting restrictions on stop and search and introducing new court orders to target known knife offenders. I agree with her, this is something we need to do more on, and she should know that the government will be fully committed to tackling it.
Gordon Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When will my right honourable friend's government bring forward any emergency legislation that's needed to deport those migrants who came across the Channel illegally in small boats and are now being put up in hotels paid for by hard-pressed British taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are determined to do whatever it takes to break the business model of people smugglers who are causing the needless loss of life of people across the Channel and putting unsustainable pressure on our asylum system. Our Nationality and Borders Act, opposed by the party opposite, Mr. Speaker, gives us new powers which we fully intend to use, and we will take further measures as required to properly control our borders and reduce the number of illegal crossings.
Andy McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was sad to see in a video from his Oxford days the future Prime Minister saying he hadn't a single friend who was working class. And he's not likely to make any soon, because while he sits on a personal fortune, he's refusing the reasonable demands of nurses, railway workers and many others forced to take industrial action just to make ends meet. Why doesn't he give them the wage increases they need and fund it by making the rich pay the same rate on unearned income as workers have to pay for their hard graft? And whilst he's at it, why not scrap the non-dumb tax loophole that he's all too familiar with, which is costing the public £3.2 billion?
Mr. Speaker, I have nothing but admiration and gratitude to our nurses for all the work they do. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it is simply unreasonable and unaffordable to have a 19% pay rise. Now, if that's what the honourable gentleman thinks is, I'm sure the Labour Party can explain to us how they would pay for that and the impact it would have on inflation. But I tell you this, Mr. Speaker, if he really wants to support working people, maybe he should get off the picket line and end the strikes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The train service between Wilmslow in my constituency and London was always hourly, direct, and took 1 hour 50. Now, you'd be very lucky if you got a direct train, and the journey time is double, or often double. And that's not restricted to strike days, that's day in, day out on Avanti trains. So can the Prime Minister tell my constituents what the government's going to do to sort this out and get the West Coast service back to what it used to be, because the service at the moment is completely unacceptable?
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the unacceptable deterioration in the quality of Avanti's service. The Transport Secretary is rightly monitoring and holding them to account. There is a plan to increase the number of trains to 100 additional drivers, Mr. Speaker, and restoring the full direct service between Manchester and London. But what this plan needs, Mr. Speaker, and I hope the party opposite support it, is trade union cooperation.
Lyra Wilson, Rabbit, you lot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure members opposite felt a certain sense of déjà vu watching the Welsh defence during last night's match. After all, they know what it feels like to have Marcus Rashford run rings round them. Mr. Speaker, off the pitch, Marcus Rashford has been a tireless campaigner on child hunger. So, in the face of fierce Conservative opposition. So, will the Prime Minister, given that he delivered on the pitch last night, will the Prime Minister give him the best thanks possible by delivering free school meals for every child living in poverty?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're supporting almost 2 million children with free school meals. We also, last year, invested hundreds of millions of pounds in the new Holiday Activity and Food Programme, which is broadening that support through the holidays for those kids who need it, on top of our work to roll out breakfast clubs across the country.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The pandemic has played havoc with school attendance, and the Children's Commissioner says that almost 115,000 children are now being home educated, a 34% higher than before the pandemic, with little, if any, monitoring of their educational welfare. Even worse, 9 in 10 local authorities believe they have not been able to identify home-educated children. So when will my right honourable friend be bringing forward the register of homeschooled children so they're identified and we can be sure that their needs are looked after and they're not falling through the net?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we support the right of parents to home-educate their children, and we know many do well. But however, this is not the case for all, and that's why local authorities must seek to identify those children missing education. We've published guidance on the arrangements they should be following, and indeed make sure that they have oversight of elective home education.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After record payouts last year to shareholders, the Royal Mail recently this year announced huge half-year losses and plans to cut 10,000 jobs, while threatening the cherished universal service obligation, which guarantees a minimum 6-day-a-week letter delivery service in the tradition of the Black Penny from 1840. Why has his government not yet committed to investigate the mismanagement and cack-handed mismanagement of this iconic British service and protecting its future and loyal postal workers?
Mr. Speaker, again, I have nothing but gratitude and appreciation for the hard work of our postal workers. But when it is not the right approach. It is not the right approach to go on strike, especially demanding pay, as we have heard, that is simply unaffordable for hard-working British taxpayers. The Honourable Lady would do well to see that, because in the context that we're in, it is simply not possible to give people the type of pay demands that they are making.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to the unique geography of Briggangool and the Isle of Axholme, we are one of the most flood-prone areas of the country. So whilst I welcome the record £5.4 billion of flood defence funding, can I ask the Prime Minister, ahead of next year's budget, to look at easing the rules around how that money is spent, so more of it can be spent on maintenance, which is so important to keeping my constituents dry?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to look at that for my honourable friend. He's right to highlight the doubling of the investment that this government has put in flood defences, but it's right that we get the mix right between that, and I'll take that away with him.
Liam Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The West Midlands Chief Constable has revealed that a vulnerable child was forced to spend 2 days living in a police station during a mental health crisis because the right specialist help could not be found for them. I know more and more young people are unable to access appropriate support for mental health. Will he accept Labour's plans to scrap private school charitable status and use the money to fund a mental health professional in every school?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the Honourable Lady, we've already committed to offer all state schools a grant to train a senior mental health lead by the end of this Parliament. Already 6 out of 10 have doing so. There's funding for all of them to have it. In addition to that, we're increasing the support that we give to those with eating disorders, because she's right, mental health does affect young people. This government is backing those people to get the support that they need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The number of people crossing the Channel is a national emergency. The number of migrants in hotels is a national emergency. Isn't it time we had a Cobra-style committee involving the DWP, DLUC, the Home Office and led by Number 10 to tackle this crisis?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's frustration, and I want to reassure him that we will do whatever it takes to reduce the number of illegal crossings to this country, take any new powers that we need to. I look forward to working with him to ensure we can do that, because this is fundamentally about our sovereignty, Mr. Speaker, and the proper control of our borders. Whilst the Labour Party have tried to oppose every measure we have taken, we will keep going, because we need to make sure that we stop the crossings.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the UK Government's Regulatory Policy Committee stated that the retained EU law bill is not fit for purpose. The Institute for Directors, the TUC and countless others have urged the Government to scrap the bill. And businesses across Scotland have already suffered severe economic damage under this Tory Brexit agenda, and they now see the outlook clouded with even more complexity and uncertainty. If the Prime Minister is serious about protecting the economy and looking after SMEs, why not do the right thing and scrap this disastrous ideological bill now?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually taking advantage of our freedoms is going to drive growth and jobs and prosperity in the United Kingdom. Whether it's in life sciences, whether it's reducing the burdens on data for those SMEs, whether it's in the financial services industry in Scotland, that's how we're going to create prosperity across this nation, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're going to get on and deregulate post-Brexit.
I'm going to come again, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and the Chancellor have rightly pointed out that levelling up is for the whole of the United Kingdom. And as a Southampton man, my right honourable friend will know that since the 1970s, Eastleigh has been promised a much-needed Chickenhall Lane bypass. So will he agree to meet me and Hampshire County Council to finally get this project moving?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's right that we spread opportunity across the country, including in Eastleigh and the South. I understand that it's for Hampshire County Council to bring forward the proposal for the bypass, which I hope they do at the next funding opportunity, and I'll ensure that my honourable friend and the Council have a meeting with the Transport Minister as soon as possible.
Final question on Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tory ideology has blocked onshore wind development in Scotland for years. Peterhead carbon capture clusters lost out in funding twice and still only classed as a reserve. Pump storage hydro schemes have been blocked because the UK Government won't discuss a pricing mechanism. If the Prime Minister actually does care about net zero and cares about Scottish jobs, will at least take action to advance Peterhead CCS and pump storage hydro in Scotland?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only are we supporting in this country carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, offshore wind, all new technologies that will help us get to net zero, all of which will create jobs in Scotland, we're also supporting our transition, Mr. Speaker, and that's good for the Scottish economy and it's good for Scottish jobs and something the SNP would do well to support.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
And that brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's questions. And it was pretty feisty, a little bit of Punch and Judy, may I say, returning there to the sparring across the dispatch box between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Let's welcome our guest for this part of Politics Live for the government, Paul Scully, Digital Economy Minister from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Carl, and Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, is here too. It was very much Keir Starmer leaning in to to the issue of private schools and their charitable status. It was very much whose side are you on, Rishi Sunak, pointing, of course, to the fact that Rishi Sunak went to Winchester College. He used that as an example of a school that has huge resources, perhaps at the expense of the state school system. Then it was the housing targets and the housing issue. What did you make of it all?
So I thought on the private schools thing, it was interesting that Keir Starmer decided to kind of lean into that dividing line. Now, Labour have had that policy for a while about removing charitable status, which would mean that parents who send their children to private schools would be paying VAT on school fees. And there's an argument about what that would then mean in terms of the affordability of some private schools for some parents. Would that mean that they go out of business and then there'd be more children into the state sector? Where does it end up in terms of the kind of benefit or not to the exchequer? But in the political argument stakes, it's one, isn't it, about fairness, and that's so often in the eye or the ear of the beholder, and aspiration.
Absolutely.
And so it was quite interesting that after a couple of days where the Daily Mail has put that issue on its front page, it's not surprising. You wouldn't expect Labour to suddenly abandon the policy, but it's interesting that Keir Starmer decided he would proactively pick it as a theme and run with it. And I thought what was striking was that he felt confident to do that, but Rishi Sunak felt confident to say, no, I'm going to defend the idea of aspiration and the idea of parental choice. So it's an interesting dividing line, that. And then on housing and housing targets in England, this is fascinating because you're beginning to see from Labour them trying to build up an argument that portrays the Prime Minister as weak. So that's their, if you like, the theme that they're trying to build, and they're using the housing argument and this whole idea that we were talking about before Prime Minister's questions with Theresa Villas around whether or not it's a good idea to have a housing target or get rid of a house building target in England. And Keir Starmer saying, Rishi Sunak, I'm your mate, really. I'll help you out. Labour can help you out here. We'll vote with you on this stuff. And therefore, it doesn't matter how many of your backbenchers don't like this stuff, because collectively we'll have a huge majority to get this through. It was striking the Prime Minister ducked that invitation entirely and talked about something not entirely related in the answer.
And just briefly, are you pleased about that you will be siding with the government on this to help them get their legislation through?
Siding with Rishi Sunak, not with the government, because it's governing party MPs who are trying to block it. It's to block an amendment which would scupper it. So yes, we'll put country first. Rishi Sunak will put country first. Tony Blair several times relied on Tory votes to get key legislation through because he put the country first. Keir Starmer is in that tradition. It is strong leadership, leading your party, putting the interests of the country first. And if that's what it takes to get houses built so that people can get on the property ladder, that's what the Labour Party will do.
It's really difficult, isn't it, for Rishi Sunak to get stuff through at the moment. He is going to have to probably continually rely on Labour support, despite his notional majority.
Well, no, what we have to do is make sure that we get the legislation right so that we can deliver for the country. Peter's absolutely right in that regard.
Who are rebelling are just...
I think because it is difficult in so much that people have got difficult positions in their own constituency, for example, but we've got to make sure that we're making strategic decisions for the country.
All right, let's catch up with Peter Barnes from the Political Research Unit. Let's talk about some of the statistics, Peter, because you always hear housing statistics, who built what when, traded quite often at Prime Minister's questions. What was the truth of it?
Well, again, with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, they're very precise with how they describe their statistics. And as you say, they were trading statistics this week on housing as well as the stuff on private schools. And again, like last week, they both said true things. So the question that Keir Starmer put to Rishi Sunak was about the rate of home ownership. He said that home ownership was more remote possibility than it was 12 years ago. And that is certainly true. The proportion of people who own their own homes has declined from a peak of about 71% in 2003. It's now something like 65%. It's quite difficult to get very up-to-date stats on that. But there's clearly been a decline in the proportion of people who own their own homes. And Rishi Sunak's counter was to talk about house building. Now, we've heard about this target. They've got 300,000 homes a year in England. They are nowhere near that at the moment. There are nowhere near that many homes being built. But he was able to say that the current government, or at least the number of homes being built in the last year we've got data for, was the highest for 15 years.
Right.
Now, there are different ways to cut up house building stats, but if you look at housing starts, that's the number of new homes that people have started to build, the figure for 2021-22 was just over 174,000, and that was indeed the highest since 2005-06, when it was 183,000. So he did have something correct to say about house building going up from its lows. But Keir Starmer was also right that the rate of ownership is much lower than it was in the past.
Thank you very much.
Just to point out that 15 years ago was a Labour government. You know, so it's the highest rate he's been building houses since Labour were last in.
All right, Peter, well, thank you for underlining the bit of truth there from Keir Starmer. Peter Barnes, thank you to you for looking at those figures. We're going to talk about private schools because, as Chris was saying, this was something that Keir Starmer focused many of his questions on. Labour saying that private schools would no longer be granted their charitable status under a Labour government. The estimate is it amounts to about £3 billion a year to private schools. Around 7% of pupils attend those sorts of schools, with a dig at Rishi Sunak and his education. Let me just show you this in the Times. Michael Gove, he was referenced, in fact, Cabinet Minister, put VAT on school fees and soak the rich. This is from 2017. Removing the tax advantages of private schools would boost standards in the state sector and raise vital extra funds. He's right.
Actually, I don't think he is. I think one of the first things Tony Blair did was abolish assisted places in 1997.
Let's concentrate on what the Conservative
and there was a dampening, you know, a lot of debate around the dampening of social mobility. You get to the point now when, of course, we want to increase the standards in the state education system around the country, but economically, I don't think it actually stacks up. Why? Because the first thing that will go. Keir Starmer talked about Winchester and a lot of the elite schools. There's a massive chunk of mid-range independent schools, especially prep schools and the like, when childcare is very difficult at the moment, that don't charge anywhere near the fees they got. And they've got a difficult model because they go up to 13 and there's less of a market for that. They will be schools that will close down anyway. Because they'll have more failing businesses. There will be the bursaries will go. Parents will start from the mid-range that can, not the elite rich who will be insulated from all this. Will take their children out, put them into the state system. Therefore, you will need more supply in the state system. Not least new schools. Where are you going to get those schools from? Where are you going to get the land to build those schools from? Tell you where, the private schools that you've just closed. So actually, you'll be buying. The government will literally find themselves buying land from the independent schools that have actually just closed down. So it'll be a circular, difficult for the economy, I think.
Do you accept that? Are you killing off aspiration, which is the charge that Rishi Sunak put to Keir Starmer for hard-working families and parents, as Rishi Sunak said, who wanted to send their son to a school like Winchester?
This is... The thing that is killing aspiration at the moment is the fact that in the last few years, the gap between state education and private education has doubled. It is now the biggest gap of attainment in the history of our education system. And it is now regional inequalities. There is inequalities between public and private sectors. So there are now so many inequalities emerging. The trends in education have just fundamentally changed in recent years. Now, when Labour was in 2007, we passed the Charities Act, which removed a third of public schools from charitable status and removed their tax break. That didn't impact at all the numbers of people moving from private schooling into state schooling. The biggest driver of social mobility in this country is state education. We need to make sure it is first rate. The thing that enabled me to move from a comprehensive school in Bognor Regis into the opportunities I've had in my life is the comprehensive school, which I had to go back to when I was 25, incidentally, and then after the fourth application, getting into higher education, getting into a university. It unlocked so much. The state route is the way to get social mobility in there, and we need to make sure that our schools are up to scratch and we can close that gap in attainment between the private sector and the state sector. And we do so in a way that gets money into our state sector, because right now it is being starved, and the rate per pupil is not going to match the funding until 2024 that it was when Labour left office in 2010. We've got to do something, and it's got to raise money, and it's got to be fair.
Paul?
Well, you know, I understand the political dogma behind this, and as I say, this is something that's been going on since the 80s. And just for frankness, I went to an independent school in the 80s, and I remember the argument then was about abolishing independent schools for the similar reasons.
Well, this isn't about abolishing, is it? Independent schools.
I agree. I understand, but I mean the argument, the philosophical argument behind it is similar. But I come back to the economic point. I just don't think the numbers stack up to actually be able to drive the investment.
Well, let me put this to you. This is what Michael Gove went on to say in this article. Private school fees are VAT exempt. That tax advantage allows the wealthiest in this country, indeed the very wealthiest in the globe, to buy a prestige service that secures their children a permanent positional edge in society at an effective 20% discount. Do you agree?
I come back to the point, actually, what you're going to be affecting, the unintended consequence of all of this is not those people who, yes, you will get 20% of those extra from those people because they will pay it. They'll happily stump up the cash for that. What you will starve is the people in the middle, the taxi drivers, the Tamil taxi drivers that are going into Whitgift School in Croydon, the people that are giving up or maybe working a second job to put their people through some of the schools around Sutton and Surrey, for example, around near my patch.
Yes.
And they are the ones that will actually be pushed into a different school and add pressure onto those schools.
Well, do you accept then, I mean, you are a Brighton MP. There is a very prestigious school, Brighton College, in your constituency or in your area. Do you accept what Paul is saying, that if you enacted those policies under a Labour government, that there would be a certain number, I don't know how many, pupils who wouldn't be able to afford an increase or hike in the fees that Brighton College would charge? They'd have to leave.
I don't think Brighton College is a great example because I think Brighton College will always be able to recruit at the price that they're paying, including the rate.
Fine. But I'm not talking about the college, I'm talking about the pupils that might not be able to go in the way that Paul has described.
I have already been to independent schools in my constituency to explain firsthand why we have this policy. And it comes down to this. Our finances as a country are shot. Because of the mini budget, we have massive pressures. So if we are going to invest in other areas of public life, we've got to raise the money from somewhere. Where is the fairest way to do it? Now, right now, we are subsidising private education. The question is, if we are going to invest more in carers, in making sure that kids don't go to school hungry and they can eat at the beginning of the day, in getting the class sizes down, in investing in the quality of teaching we have, getting a great teacher in every classroom, because we can get the professional development done, we've got to raise the money somewhere. We are saying we will do it by raising money, by taking away a tax break that even the former Education Secretary, Michael Gove, says is egregious.
So just quickly, at the moment, you talk about subsidising by 20%. You are paying, effectively, 20% towards those children's education. You will be paying 100% towards those children's education if they were in the state system.
Right. Let's just talk about fairness, because this is what the argument comes down to. It's interesting listening to the two politicians talk about aspiration, talk about fairness, talk about in difficult economic times you have to make choices, and there are no sort of pain-free choices, presumably. Where do you think this is going to sort of end, this discussion? Because I think it is probably the most outspoken I've heard a discussion on the charitable status for private schools.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things, isn't there? One is, where does the argument go around the numbers? So the extent to which this can either generate money or cost money for the Exchequer, and where does the evidence basis of that go if the argument becomes as passionate as it looks like it might? But then there's the bigger picture argument, which we've seen fleshed out here, around those two weighty concepts, and they're huge concepts, aren't they? And again, they're in the eye or ear of the beholder around fairness and aspiration. And as I say, for me, the striking thing in the exchange was both sides willing to lean into their existing position. So Rishi Sunak making a passionate defence around, his notion around aspiration, and Keir Starmer's around fairness. And where does that end? Clearly, Labour are passionate about sticking to this and think that it's a vote winner. And the Conservatives will argue, on that point around aspiration, that it can be a vote winner on the other side of that ledger. So it's fascinating to me that after a couple of days where a Labour leadership might have felt nervous around such a big selling and influential newspaper as the Daily Mail gunning on a topic that, in the grand scheme of things right now might seem relatively minor, the decision taken by the Keir Starmer's team is, no, we're actually going to go for this and properly lean into it in the big forum of the week.
Just to clarify, what we're passionate about is doing fully costed programmes, fully costed policies that are going to tackle the big issues at the moment. We're not going to run away from the big issues, but also with Rachel Reeves at the helm of the finances for us and Keir Starmer, we are going to tackle those big issues in a fully costed way. That means difficult decisions. That's what.
But it's also got to be dynamic. It's got to be dynamic because I've talked about displacement. I've talked about children coming out. So if you just sit there and look at a cost of, right, we take that 20% back, that's one model. But if you actually look at the closures, the children that would come into the state system, that's the dynamic modelling that you must factor in.
I'm intrigued, Peter, as well, that you made an argument around the current state of the public finances as part of your justification. Does that mean it's temporary, that when the public finances were in a better place, you'd revert to where we are now?
Well, it's absolutely true that the dial on fairness has changed since the 2000s when we removed a third of the charitable statuses and therefore...
Yeah, but that's not what I asked. I just wonder, is this a temporary thing that's a practical consequence
that's
of where
even
the
worse,
public finances
because
are?
then you get all the cost and none of the benefit.
I'm just intrigued given that was part of your argument.
So the dial on fairness will change again when Labour gets a grip on the finances again and gets growth back into the economy.
Change the policy,
and we will have to make a decision at the time where we invest the proceeds of growth, and we will invest that where it is most fairly delivered.
Temporary. It's a practical thing.
So we will make decisions
thing.
at the time where we will invest. I think it's very unlikely that the first priority will be to reinvest in private education when we've got so much ambition for our state schools. We want to put private schools out of business by raising the standards in the state sector, not by taxing them. But this is a one-in-a-generation challenge that the Tories have created because of blowing a hole in our finances. We've got to make tough decisions. It's really interesting that today Keir Starmer was rushing towards the tough decisions and he was spelling out the vested interests that he would tackle.
But you're not rushing towards committing to it being a permanent shift. You're framing it as an immediate response to current fiscal reality.
What I'm not doing is tying the hands of any future Labour government. But when fairness comes back to the economy, and it's a growing economy again, we will make decisions based on where the fairest way of spending it is. I think it's very unlikely that will be investing in the private schools, but I think that these are decisions that the future Labour government will have to make. And the premise is it will be a Labour government, and that for me is quite interesting.
Well, that is interesting on the philosophy question, isn't it? As you say, it looks as if it is a more pragmatic response than a philosophical one necessarily, without wanting to put words into your mouth. I just want to read you this piece of breaking news. This is the RMT union. We're in the middle, of course, of waves of strike action. Eurostar security staff to strike for 4 days in December over pay. You can take a moment to read the rest of it. As I say to Paul Scully, we heard Rishi Sunak saying above inflation pay rises. The nurses have asked for 19%. Inflation is 11.5%. Is it unaffordable? Should they have below inflation pay rises only?
Yeah, I think it's something that you've got to match up if you look at what's happening in the private sector as well. What we've tried to do is give fair pay. We've accepted the recommendations of the pay review bodies. But obviously, I mean, the nurses' strike, for example, just to put that in context, I think it's £9 billion that we'd have to find for the increase in the NHS budget to satisfy that.
So we need to work out where that's going to go. The historic strikes, we need
to make sure that actually people can get around the table and have a reasoned, proportionate settlement now. Why? Because then we've got to make sure that actually the cost of living issue, the inflation pressures, don't last as little as they can, because otherwise we'll be back here the year after, and then jobs will start to go as well.
You want to get a grip on the finances, the public finances, as you put it. Do you agree, then, with Paul? It would be below inflation pay rises for nurses?
What's astonishing, listening to Paul, is he says we need to get around the table, but when it comes to transport, Grant Shapps refused all summer and all autumn to do so. And Mark Harper has just started the process.
What would your offer be to come to the table, at least, to discuss as a recommendation to the pay review body?
Two things. Firstly, it wouldn't be happening in the first place. There were no strikes in our health service under the Labour government for 13 years.
But that's what the Mayor of London, the City can't promise that.
The first time in 106 years that the nurses are going out on strike. So we need to get the government around the table. I mean, everything needs to be on the table when you go into negotiations. Government needs to make sure that it is being a reasonable negotiating partner, but it's got to be active. We have industrial action right the way across our economy now, and it's only going to get worse.
Do you agree,
it won't get better until the second point I was going to make is getting a grip on the basics of running an economy, getting the essentials right, stabilising the economy, then getting growth into it. We believe we have the plan to do so.
And in the meantime, do you agree with Rishi Sunak that those pay demands of 90% are unaffordable?
I believe that he should get round the table, and his government should, and start negotiating, and everything needs to be on the table going into those negotiations. He needs to do
Are they unaffordable?
It's not for me to say, in each specific say, whether it is. These are Tory issues because of Tory mismanagement of the economy. You've been in for almost 13 years.
They're not
you
Tory
blew a
issues.
hole in the finances
issues.
with a £45 billion hole. There is no resilience in our public services. There is no resilience in personal finances.
You started off talking about the amendments to the bill later on, about the fact that this is doing it for the country. This is not Tory issues. These are country issues. These are people up and down.
Inflation is hitting our country worse than other
these are people up and down.
Simply because there is no... 20% of households have no savings whatsoever.
These are people up and down the country that are being affected by the strikes. You've got Mick Lynch writing to hospitality sector today to say, why don't you go and ask for the government cap in hand for for extra support because I know we are going to be affecting
you. And it is your government
You're going to be affecting you in the lead up to
low-paid workers
we're going to be affecting you in the lead up to Christmas. We're going to be disrupting your business. So
well, I wonder
this is a UK issue.
How you'll address the argument as a government into the new year, where a viewer might think, whoever's fault it is, and clearly there's international factors that are playing into our current economic situation, of just a sense that stuff's not working, where you're seeing the scale of industrial action in so many different sectors that collectively people might just think things aren't working and fairly or otherwise sort of point the blame in the direction of the government.
I don't think it would be otherwise, but I totally understand that frustration because, you know, when people are just trying to go about their business, just trying to get a train, just trying to get a tube, trying to get into work and do a day's work, when they see that disruption, they don't really care who's to blame. They just want stuff to work.
Well, no, they might want to blame people, and it isn't just transport, is it? We are talking about nurses, ambulance drivers, Royal Mail, civil servants, barristers. This is all on
because
your watch.
they've all got the same pressure, and you are seeing this, these same pressures, employment pressures around the world. You're seeing the same pressure in America, you're seeing the same pressure in Europe because of the same global inflationary and cost of living pressures. So we have to make sure that, as I say, our situation in the UK is as short a difficult situation as possible, by actually doing the things that Peter's saying, not having plans to do it in the future, doing it now, making sure we can stabilise the markets. I think Jeremy Hunt's statement went a long way towards that just recently. Make sure that we can get proportionate pay deals so that we're not extending inflation into beyond 23.
Right, there is another question because you've decided to uprate pensions and benefits at 10.1%. Slightly below now where inflation is. Why won't you offer that? Why won't you put 10.1%? If you're giving it to pensioners and for people on benefits, why not give all these people 10%?
The negotiations themselves are there for the NHS, the
why can't that be your guiding principle?
Because we've accepted the pay review bodies that have come up with a proportionate
You can guide that. I'm just saying, can you see why people watching might think, why are you uprating these things, these big ticket items, rightly or wrongly, by 10.1%? Well, why won't you give that as a
Because all the fiscal stuff around benefits and pensions and tax is the direct responsibility of the Chancellor. The pay negotiations are the responsibility for train operators, etc. No, because actually that's why Mark Harper got involved in the discussions to have talks. But it's not him. But it's not him doing the negotiations. That's what I'm saying.
No, and at the same ticket, it isn't Mark Harper doing the negotiations. Should pay keep up with prices?
Look, these things. First of all, you've got to get a grip on the economy, and then we're not speaking. So
these people are going on strike now.
Paul, exactly. But we've seen these strikes coming. You could have seen this industrial action coming from space. It's been so long in the making. We've seen that the underlying factors driving industrial action has been there. We've been talking about winter of discontent since last winter, about this winter.
But what you also see is people in the private sector that have not had a pay rise at all, that are looking in on this slightly bemused, thinking, well, what about me?
But I think we'll find private pay is ahead of it. And actually, in those areas where they've been negotiating with unions, actually it's been a productive relationship.
What would you say to Lloyd Russell-Moore? He was sitting here a little while ago saying that actually he thinks pay should keep up with prices or maybe go a bit beyond. Do you think that is how many Labour MPs feel?
That it should be our aspiration, but that's why we want to get a grip on running the economy properly. We would not be in this mess if we hadn't had a government that blew a hole in our finances. We've got to find £45 billion. You know, Paul mentioned Jeremy Hunt's budget the other day, and he was about to tackle these issues. That budget was solely, and all the briefing and running up to it, was about appeasing the markets after having a £45 billion hole blown in it 3 weeks earlier by his own party. So, you know, this is the situation we're in. It's made worse. There are international factors, but don't deny there is very big.
There doesn't seem to be much difference between you guys.
There's a big difference
on the reality of these pay demands versus what is realistic in the current economic climate.
There is a big difference because we wouldn't be in this mess if we hadn't had the quasi-Quartang budget and we hadn't had 10 years
where
of
we
mismanagement
are now,
of the economy.
are you saying anything different from...
Having been driven into... I accept the premise of your question because having been driven into this ditch by the Tories, how will the Labour Party get us out of it? I accept that. And we would do so by getting a grip on the essentials of the economy and working with where there needs to be all parties in industrial disputes before they arise, hopefully, so we can get the basics right.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, what we've heard is that, I accept the premise of the question. I'm not a Tory, is basically what Peter's saying. And but effectively, what you've seen is that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has put measures in place now to stabilise the economy. To then get to the next stage. We've got to clearly have the growth that Peter was talking about behind that, but we've got to make sure that we can get through a really difficult winter, that we can plug the gaps in the finances, but that it's not just by a difficult situation.
Right.
That mini budget
why was the economy unstable, Paul?
It was unstable anyway, and it was further destabilised by the response to Positive Wilderness budget.
We've got to get to the next stage. It's time for a change. I mean, it is time that Paul has just blown the lid on why it's time for a fundamental change.
We've just had the change. We've just had the change, and that's what the Chancellor has put in place.
Let me just ask a quick question before we go, Paul, because you're in charge of gambling. I mean, not personally in terms, but you are. But can you tell us when the government will publish the Gambling Review White Paper?
All I can say is in the next few weeks. I really want to get it out of the door.
It is going to be before Christmas, is it?
It's going to be in the next few weeks. I'll tell you for why, because I've just literally left a meeting with Gambling with Lives and other people who have been really badly affected by that. I want to make sure I get it absolutely right, rather than rush it. Well, if it's
in the next few weeks, it is before Christmas, isn't it?
Well, it depends how you define that, but look, I want to get out of the door as soon as it comes.
Talk about politicians are.
No, I want to get it right.
Revealing bit of news.
We've got to get it right.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.